Hello and welcome to The Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. On today's show, I'm speaking to Aamina Ahmad about her novel, The Return of Faraz Ali, which I found so moving, multi-layered and immersive, taking us into the heart of the red light district of Lahore, Pakistan. We follow Faraz Ali from when he was removed from his courtesan mother at just 5 years old, and as he grows up with a longing to understand who he is and where he comes from. The story involves a detective crime plot and spans multiple timelines, including the Second World War and the 1971 Bangladesh War of Independence. I really enjoyed the book, and I'm so pleased to be speaking to Aamina today. Aamina Ahmad is a British fiction writer and playwright based in the US. She has 2 book publications, the play The Dishonoured and her novel The Return of Faraz Ali, which was named a new work to read by the New York Times, quietly stunning by the New York Times Book Review, and a most anticipated book by both The Millions and Book Culture. She is a creative writing professor at the University of Minnesota and is the winner of a Rona Jaffe Foundation Writers Award. Hello, Aamina. Welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you for having me. It's nice to be here.
I'm so glad that you could join me on the show today. I'm really looking forward to learning a bit more about you and talking about your work, especially your beautiful novel, The Return of Faraz Ali. But before we kind of get into the book and some of the themes that you write about, I'd like to know a little bit about how you came to writing and what your journey as a writer has been like.
Oh, that's a really interesting question because I haven't had a very straightforward journey as a writer. I was always writing. I think like a lot of writers, I started writing quite young and I was writing stories. A big kind of component of that was that my mum is a writer. So my mum is a playwright mainly, but has also written prose. And so there was someone in my house writing. And that was one of the things that sort of spurred me to write and to feel like, oh, I can do this. This is something that people do, in fact. And because of my mum's work, there were a lot of drama people around. And she founded a theatre company. And so actually, as I was growing up, I knew I would write. I think at a certain point, I thought I'm going to have something to do with writing, but I thought I was going to make drama. And initially, I went to school to do television drama, and I thought I would maybe direct. I ended up working at the BBC as a script editor, actually, on a lot of various TV shows, things like EastEnders. So I did that for a long while. But at the same time, I kind of kept knowing, I knew I wanted to write, but I just thought it was going to be scripts because drama and scripts had been the world that I'd been in. And prose, I wrote some stories kind of for myself, but I didn't really share them with anyone. And then I ended up joining a writers group, really just to kind of meet people. I had moved and I thought it would be like a fun thing to do. And I had done so much script stuff. I knew I didn't want to join a script writing group. So I joined a prose group. And it was my first experience of being in a workshop. And I absolutely loved it. And I loved reading prose stories and talking about them. And the group were very encouraging. I had a really encouraging teacher. And that was the thing that kind of, I think, was one of the key moments where I thought, oh, maybe drama isn't the only thing that I want to do.
Wow, that's really interesting. And actually, did you ever feel the pressure of writing because your mother was a writer? Like, sometimes how if your parents are a certain profession, one there are like huge expectations, or you have kind of like expectations with regards to the quality of things that you must be producing. But also kind of like in her legacy, did you ever feel that kind of pressure?
I think probably there was a certain amount of I wasn't aware of it, I think, particularly the pressure, but there probably was and is. I admire my mum's writing so much. And also just, I think what I really appreciated about my mum was that so much of her work was about supporting other writers. She ended up founding a theatre company called Gali, who have produced a huge number of South Asian women writers in the UK, and we're at the forefront of doing that. And it's sort of, you end up putting your own writing on the back burner so that you can help other writers, younger writers, newer writers, find their feet and give them a platform. And so I think I was very aware of that writing was not just something you did for you, but it was also a way to make a community and to contribute something to a community. So in that way, I definitely feel the pressure of that legacy, as I think. But I was very, very lucky that both my parents were like just incredibly supportive. Like first I was like, oh, I want to make films. Oh, I want to do this. I want whatever it was. They were like, all right, patiently kind of supporting me and my siblings as well, actually. I think what was great about having a writer in the house was that I just had someone to talk to about stories all the time and to share work with, who would give me feedback and support. And I think for a lot of people who maybe don't have access to a writing community, writing can feel very lonely, very, very solitary, and you don't necessarily know. You have to do the work to build a community and find other writers. And I had that very easy access. I also got to see, I think, how hard it can be to try and make art, because there was my mum writing, and then there were actors and directors around, and I saw that, like each piece of work, there are struggles and challenges all the way. It isn't kind of like you write a book and it becomes a bestseller at all. And, you go from one gig to the next. So I think all those lessons were very useful. So perhaps not much pressure. I think more insight. It gave me just a lot of insight.
That's so fascinating, because actually a lot of authors that I have spoken to, I mean, some South Asian, but from a whole range of backgrounds, grew up with this belief that although they loved to write and that they did want to write, they didn't know that writing was something that they could do, like professionally or like long term. So it's so interesting to hear like a different perspective. But did you, like while growing up, did you encounter people your age, say also of a South Asian background or, any kind of background that held that different worldview about writing?
For sure. I think most of us grew up in a kind of quite a risk-averse world. Like, the idea was pick a profession that is going to be safe and it's going to be secure, and you go and you do your law degree, or you try and get a professional qualification that is going to set you up. So certainly, I think there was sometimes skepticism. I think sometimes, I had friends who were like, I wish I had that choice. Like they didn't necessarily feel that they had support from home to go and take that kind of a risk. And so I knew that my environment was very unusual. And I think we all recognize that we were really lucky that we didn't have that thing of like, be a doctor, be a dentist, find it, which was happening to lots and lots of my friends. So yeah, I really appreciated that.
Yeah, well, that sounds just honestly like such an interesting, insightful, and like creative environment to have been like living such formative years of your own life. Because I think that kind of community that you describe, a lot of people who are writers or who are creatives manage to find it somehow, but like way later in life and way later in their career. And so it just sounds so special that like you had access to it, or not even just access, that you could see it in front of you, that you knew that this was something that your mother was working so hard for. And I just think that that's so great. But let's talk a little bit about your novel, The Return of Faraz Ali. So please, if you could just take a few moments just to introduce it, tell anyone listening what the novel's about.
Yeah, sure. The Return of Faraz Ali tells the story of it's set in the 1960s primarily in Pakistan, and it tells the story of a police inspector who is sent to the red light district to cover up the murder of a very young girl. And as he's there investigating, we discover that he has his own connection to the neighborhood and to the red light district. And so the story becomes an investigation not just into the murder, but also into his past and where he must kind of grapple with who he is and where he's from. And in many ways, the story is a lot about, what we inherit and what we do with that inheritance. And that becomes kind of his struggle throughout the book. But the book ranges around. It moves from different time periods and it yo-yos from the 1960s to later in the 70s and goes as far back as the Second World War.
So I absolutely loved the book. I found it, I generally really like kind of like dual timelines. I think they're so interesting, and especially if executed well, like they really add different layers to the story. But I just thought your ability to bring to life Lahore and the different areas that we travel into through in the book and the characters, it was really, really something fascinating. Honestly, I thought it was so well done.
Oh, thank you.
Why did you decide to write a story based in the red light district in Pakistan, in Lahore?
Yeah, I think the first thing was that I knew I wasn't wanted to write about Lahore, and I had been writing a lot of the short stories I'd been writing were about Pakistan and various places, but Lahore was the place I knew best growing up because I had been going there since I was a kid. We went pretty frequently. My dad's family home was on Durand Road, which was not very far from the old city of Lahore. So the red light district is in what is called Androon Shahr, so the inner city of Lahore. But it's only one small piece of the inner city. The whole of the old city is renowned for various things, for its artists and for food. So there are lots of things that are quite fascinating about that area. And then there was this little world of the red light district. And I think part of the reason was that I would go as a kind of visitor to Lahore. But when Lahoris talked to me about the old city, it seemed like the old city was also a place that they didn't know very well. Like it felt very separate to their Lahore, and they felt like there's the Shahr and then there's the rest of Lahore. So it felt a little bit mysterious even to them. And I thought I was essentially quite intrigued by the mysteriousness of this place. With the red light district, Pakistan is a very socially conservative place, and I was really interested in the fact that just very close to where I was staying was this district where these women were working, sex workers were working. And I just found myself wondering, like, how do you survive? How do you thrive? How do you live in an environment that is as conservative as this one? How do you work? How do you maintain your sense of safety? Is it safe? All of these things were things I just wondered about and was curious about. And I found myself and kind of very interested in those questions, but also partly because there is a strong tradition in Pakistani, or in fact all of South Asian culture, of kind of both romanticizing and mythologizing the courtesan. So I'd also grown up watching films like Pakiza and Amrajan Ada. So we had this very kind of regal version of like the courtesan's lifestyle and the world of art and music and dance, and they were all kind of integrated together. And so that was the tradition that you were aware of. So the other thing that I think I was conscious of as I was thinking about, what stories I wanted to write was the way in which the women in this neighborhood were viewed so differently. There was a kind of admiration for some of their skills traditionally, or their traditions, as singers and dancers. And yet there was something salacious and scandalous about them if you were from the kind of world I was from, which was, a kind of the more respectable world outside the walled city, and a more middle class, polite world of drawing rooms. So all of those things, I think, were things that drew me to this as a subject.
It's so insightful, and I really enjoyed hearing you speak about that just now, because these are questions that I've also always had. And I think this about many different societies around the world too, how there are certain things that are held up and, I don't know, like used for celebration or to like, you know, in like ornament as a way to, I don't know, to beautify something. But there are boundaries within that. And then up until a certain point, and then it becomes something that's actually like horrific and scandalous and looked down upon and turned away from, which is just such a strange sort of like dichotomy, because the thing itself doesn't change.
Yeah.
And the issue here is that we have real people at the heart of it, and these are essentially women who are so vulnerable in society that are not afforded the same protection that most other people have in any given society. And I just, yeah, I mean, that's what drew me to your book initially. Before I had even opened it, I was just like, I want to know what this story is, because I'm also really fascinated in this area. And another thing that I'm interested in when it comes to exploring stories from Pakistan is the issue of class. Because Pakistan is a heavily divided society when it comes to class and wealth as well. And it has, I think, now like somewhat of like a growing middle class, but poverty is rife in the country. And yet so much of the decisions that are made and everything is all kind of done by the very elite with the elite interest in mind, which is not too different really from anywhere around the world. But I wondered what you wanted to bring out about class, because obviously class also impacts the red light district area. And there's that big difference as to who these women are and the people that use their services, that employ them, in terms of class and wealth as well. So I just wondered what your insights and reflections on that are.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think class was one of the reasons I wanted to write about the book, write the book in this way. You're absolutely right that, there, like you say, there is a growing middle class. Having said that, there's extreme inequality. But the other aspect of Pakistani life, and I think one we don't talk about a lot, is there's class, but also caste. And I think this is something that's, caste is not part of our kind of Islamic kind of worldview. And Islam has an incredible emphasis on the notion of equality. And yet Pakistan is still very entrenched in a caste and class system. And so I was really interested in kind of looking a little bit at that. This is, in Pakistani society, there's very little social mobility. Once you are born into a particular strata of society, it is very difficult to move outside that. And I was really interested in the fact that the women in this community who are part of the Gunja caste are really born into the life, or certainly at this particular moment in time, and that their children are, so that their girls know from birth that this is what they are going to do. They have relatively few options outside of it. But even for women, or even for anybody within this system, everybody is very, very bound by this class system, whether you're at the top, there's a character called Wajid, who is Faraz's father, who is very much kind of in the upper echelons of this system. And yet everybody seems kind of trapped in their own way, in these kind of very specific roles of how society is supposed to function. And I think it's, when you go to Pakistan, it's very difficult to not be extremely conscious of this in every interaction, in every kind of social interaction that you have with people. And I feel that awareness everywhere I am. But in Pakistan, perhaps it was just a little bit more visible. It felt very much at the forefront of all your interactions with people. And society is so structured and built along this framework. And I was just really, really interested in looking at what is it like to grow up with such a rigid kind of hierarchy? How do you, if you are at the bottom, how do you survive it? Is there a way to thrive within it or not? And I was interested, my character Faraz Ali, who's at the center of the book, was, I think, a character I was drawn to partly because he starts off in one particular category And his father, Wajid, he's basically the son of a courtesan. And he starts off in the red light district. That's his kind of world. And he's removed from that in order to have kind of a better start in life. So a kind of removal from one class and placed in another, and yet still is incredibly hampered by all of this, that system.
So I think it's really interesting what you just said, especially about social mobility. So I spent 2 years living in Pakistan, and I was also working for a lot of that time. And I am usually somebody that finds it quite easy to make friends and to meet different people from all different backgrounds and circumstances and walks of life. But one of the things that I found really striking in Pakistan was that people's class and their social groups are really very rigid. They're very fixed. It's very difficult to get into that, and it's very difficult to understand also kind of as an outsider that doesn't really fit into any of those stratas, where you could belong. Yeah. And it's really interesting to watch interactions between different groups of society and just the different expectations that are placed upon people. Sometimes a different language that gets spoken between different classes that reflect different things. I find it really, really fascinating. So there's been a lot of Pakistani literature I found that kind of has come out about focusing on this sort of upper class within Pakistan that are quite wealthy. A lot of them in the books that we're reading there's a lot of alcohol, there's a lot of things going on that are not particularly very Muslim or Islamic. I wondered what your experience has been in engaging with that kind of literature. Where do you think there might be space for improvement? Or what do you think is really missing from the landscape?
Well, that's a really interesting question. Actually makes me wonder if I'm reading widely enough. I think one of the things that is interesting to me is also obviously kind of Anglophone literature in Pakistan. In a way, the very fact that as soon as you're an Anglophone writer, that's going to limit many, many things immediately. In terms of your context and your world. And you're right, most of the writers, or most of anyone of us who come from an Anglophone tradition, are going to be we're not from working class backgrounds and don't necessarily have access to those kinds of worlds. And so it's very easy for that literature to feel very focused on a very small section of society. I think one of the things that I would like to probably see more of is more translation of writing in Urdu, because I think writers in Urdu are more likely to be dealing and investigating and interrogating things kind of across a wider kind of social strata. And there are a number of really interesting writers. Somebody was just telling me about a collection they've just bought of Punjabi stories in translation by a writer called Return Ahmad. I'm trying to get hold of that. So, there is work happening. We're just not necessarily accessing it, and which is all to do with translation and ease of translation, cost of translation, and getting people interested in translated literature. But I think the more access we have to those literatures, the wider a picture we're going to have. Because you're right, the Anglophone world is a very small world, and the number of people reading in English in Pakistan is very, very small. But that doesn't mean that the stories aren't there. I just think that we're likely not accessing them.
Yeah, I think that's so true, because the Anglophone writers also are trying to battle lots of different interests, especially if they've gone down a mainstream publishing route, for example, based in the UK or the US. There's a lot of other things that they're also dealing with. But back to your novel. So you've spoken really eloquently about the things that you're really interested in exploring. But where did this specific story of Faraz Ali and the world you have built, where did this specific story come from? What has inspired this character and the journey around his life?
Well, one of the things I think when I began the book, what I really wanted was I loved crime fiction. So I loved detective stories, and I had read Raymond Chandler and Patricia Highsmith for the first time when I went to college. And I sort of was like completely fell in love with this very noir, hard-boiled writing. And I just felt Lahore was a great city to set that kind of story in. And because I was like, Lahore has mean streets, just like LA and Chicago and all these other places that you have like PIs, investigating. So I knew, in a way, I think the idea of it began with that quite genre-based notion of I want to tell a story like that here. But I knew I wanted a character that, and what I liked about those old stories, the Raymond Chandler kind of detective stories, they had these great plots, but Chandler's heroes or Hammett's heroes, these kind of private eyes or detectives, they're often these people who are, one, they're kind of outsiders. So they don't really operate within the same structure as everybody else. But the other thing that really interested me about them was that they kind of, at one moment, they're in a mansion talking to somebody. And then the next minute, they're kind of, wandering around like a really poor neighborhood, looking for clues. And so I wanted a character who would be able to move within that, in that same way. And as soon as I knew I was going to do a police officer, it became, well, what kind of police officer is this character going to be? I think most of us recognize that there is a great deal of corruption in the police system, wherever it is, actually, whether it's in Pakistan or anywhere else. And I was really interested in a character who kind of uses that system, not necessarily. I mean, I wasn't interested in a heroic kind of figure. And Faraz is not a very heroic figure in many ways. The book opens with him beating up a protester at a street protest. So this is somebody who is kind of comfortable with being part of that system. And I was kind of interested in, what happens if you take somebody who is kind of used to that system, accepts it, is comfortable with it, and very much a tool of the state. What happens when you put them on a particular journey and they then have to stop and think and reflect on who they are and what it means to be part of this. So that's kind of where he came from, I think, really, as a character.
Now, I was really heartbroken for Faraz a lot of the book, and I was really hoping that he would have a bit more happiness. But he unfortunately doesn't get as much happiness as I had hoped for him anyway. Why did you decide, I think, to do it in that way? Because it kind of feels like it's just lots of sadness and lots of things, lots of missed opportunities, I feel like, for him as well. Mm. And as a character, I think he was already dealing with so much angst, not understanding where he had come from. So much was concealed from him, not really understanding, having this vague memory of, being taken by his father when he was 5, having these vague memories of these names in his head, but it has taken him absolutely decades upon decades to get closer to finding the answers. Why did you decide to kind of leave your readers on somewhat of tenterhooks and not have it a bit more neatly tied up for him?
It's a really interesting question. And I think a lot of people feel that way, that, I set Faraz up on this journey. The whole question throughout is he going to find his family, really? Is he going to have this big kind of reunion? And I agonized quite a lot about his ending in some ways. And I wrote it different ways. I did do versions. There were versions where he did meet his sister, because a lot of the book, the person he's like, I knew he was never going to meet his mother. I think I knew that because that felt to me the most real thing. And I think often when you're telling a story, you have an inclination to do what will feel good for readers or to you. And I think one thing with this book, I thought, I have to be real with it if it's going to feel true, like emotionally true. And although I would really love for him to have that moment of reunion, and it's what he wants more than anything, it didn't feel like it would happen. And there were a lot of practical and logistical reasons why I thought it might not happen. But I did write different versions of it. And in the end, I know you felt it was heartbreaking and he didn't get these things. But to me, in the end, the way I saw it was, I think that he gets what he needs more than what he wants. So what he wants is this reunion, this family, this, he wants to access this life that's kind of gone, that he never really had. But what ends up happening is, while he doesn't get that, I think the thing that really needs to happen for him as a person is that he needs to accept who he is and be honest about who he is to the world. And he's been living a kind of double life throughout the book of trying to be the person his father wants him to be, but also feeling tied to this past that's a mystery to himself. So in the end, for me, the way I saw it was that he didn't get what he wanted, but he got what he needed, which was a kind of piece of like reconciling, well, this is who I am. And maybe I can be those two things, or maybe I can still have a future without constantly hankering for this past that I'm actually never, ever going to have, because the past is gone. When it's gone, it's gone. But I know that many people felt that way. Many people felt quite gutted for him. But in the end, for me, I thought actually that's the happiest ending he could have.
Yeah, I mean, hearing you talk about that, I think it obviously, like, it makes complete sense. But also, just the more I reflect on it, sometimes actually the thing that holds us back is the not knowing and the not understanding. Mm-hmm. And it's the unanswered questions more so than the lack of a happy ending. Yeah. That is the thing that causes that inner turmoil that impacts everything, because he wasn't able to be present as a husband, as a father, and it was really having an impact on his everyday life. And also, like, I imagined him to like not be sleeping and to like, not be concerned about like what he was wearing, and like just be a bit moody and grumpy all of the time because he was suffering so much internally because of all these unanswered questions. And I think even if it is very sad that he never met his mother and also his sister and wasn't able to have that happy reconciliation, sometimes I think just knowing one story can do so much for who you are today. So you mentioned that you have spent time in Lahore. Did you spend time in Lahore when you were writing the book?
Actually, for most of the writing of the book, I was not in Lahore. Very early on, as I was beginning, I'd gone on a trip to see family. I had the kids with me, and my kids were very little at the time. I had a 4-month-old and a 4-year-old. And I kept thinking I'll do some research, but it is not possible to do research with a 4-year-old and a 4-month-old. And so actually, and then for the next period that I was writing the book, just logistics and life meant I just wasn't able to travel. The kids were still very little. But my husband went regularly to Pakistan. And so he would be tasked with whether it was finding books, or I need you to go to this police station, or I need you to go to interview this person. So he would have his holidays interrupted by these research requests. And, he went around the old city, came back with 1 million photographs and videos, because I was like, I need pictures of the buildings, I need pictures of these streets. And he also went to visit a very old police station, because that was something that I wanted to do. And actually, I don't know how easy that would have been for me to do anyway. It was perhaps easier for him to do that kind of research as well. So he went into a station, and, they were baffled by the fact that he was taking pictures of the ceilings and the cupboards, whatever else, their filing cabinets. But yeah, so I didn't get to do in person very much, actually. But what was interesting was I had him doing some stuff, and then I read a lot and spent a lot of time looking at maps and reading ethnographic studies of various communities. The other thing is that I knew I wasn't going to get very good access to the red light district as an area. I knew it'd be very hard to find people who would talk to me there, particularly on a flying visit of I'm here for a week. Can you, the kind of secrecy and stress for the people in that area around their work is so high. No one is going to talk to you very much about what goes on a first meeting or even a second meeting. And so the ethnographic studies I looked at were people who had gone and basically become embedded in the area. They essentially lived in the district and got to know the people over months and years, and really built up trust and relationships. And those ethnographic studies were really, really, really helpful to me. There's one is a book called Taboo. The other was The Dancing Girls of Lahore. And so those were very kind of insightful books about the way that subculture in the red light district kind of operates and functions.
That's really interesting, and I love the fact that you tasked your husband with all of these things to do. we love to hear about supportive spouses.
Yeah.
That was, and I think, I mean, a lot of what you said about having access to like a police station and getting some of those interviews, as we know, as a woman, that especially a woman that is from the UK and the US, like going to get some of that, like some of those authentic interviews and those stories is very difficult. But yeah, I mean, I couldn't tell, having read that you hadn't lived in Lahore for years upon years. So I think that's a really great achievement. So the book, we have a lot of the characters in the book are women, and obviously almost all of them are from the red district, the red light district. And I think it was very difficult reading that, because so many of them were just suffering. They had really awful things that happened to them. There was this constant sense of, but they would never get justice for the wrong things that had happened. Like a girl had died really early on in the book. What were some of the things that you were really interested in bringing out about life for women in that area in particular? And were you ever concerned about painting a picture that is like heavily negative or heavily stereotyped?
Yeah, I think those are really great and interesting questions, and definitely were things that I was thinking about as I was writing. I mean, I think when I began the process of creating the characters of the women in the red light district, I think what I wanted to do above all was kind of underline that there is no one single experience, right? Every woman's experience is different. Every woman's outlook and attitude to the world that they're in and to the work that they do is different. And so for those who is Faraz's mother, is a kind of old school courtesan who's really versed in like the idea of like our tradition, our heritage. And she's very invested in that kind of slightly more romantic sort of picture of that life, but also, in the skills that the courtesans of earlier periods had, like very real skills as artists. And she's very tied to that idea. For her daughter, Rosina, Rosina's kind of reluctant. She does the work, but she doesn't really want to be there. She understands it's the only means that she has to survive and to support her family. And her own daughter is this kind of quite wayward girl who doesn't really fit into this world at all and doesn't want anything to do with it. So I think, and then there are characters like the young girl who's died. Her mother is a woman who's very invested in the fact that, at the end of the day, this is the work that can deliver you agency in the world, because it will give you money. It can give you status. Some of the women are lucky and, in terms of how the district sees them, because they kind of escape into a new world of movies. And so again, that's a kind of social mobility. And yet it's also not, because despite the fact that those women might escape into have more wealth, have more fame and, be well known, become renowned, they remain very tied to their history and their background in terms of how the rest of society views them. They will always be from that red light area. They will always be from that background in terms of caste and class. So although it can seem very bleak, because again, everybody's a little bit trapped in this world and there aren't a lot of options for everyone, what I hoped was that, one, you would see this thing about everybody's view of the work is different, but also that you would see that within that community of women is a lot of support for one another, a lot of love. These women are working and trying to survive and stay alive. You know, this setup affords them no safety as workers, but they are trying to survive and keep their families going. And to me, that felt like just the same as what every other mum and woman in Pakistan is kind of trying to do, look after their families, whether it's their children or their parents. So I suppose what I wanted to show that, like, you know, just trying to survive in that is not very easy. But also, while they also don't have a lot of options, it's worth remembering that they are often breadwinners. They are supporting the family, and that does give them some sense of say, and they are always struggling to kind of be the masters of their own destiny. Someone like Faraz's wife in the novel, there's a character called Masarat. Faraz's wife is a middle-class woman from a very respectable background. She in theory has it all, but she herself is also quite marginalized and quite powerless within her own domestic setup. She doesn't, and perhaps, and probably in some senses, has less say than some of the women who are at least head of their own households do. So, I mean, I think that, you know, I wanted to be really honest about how those structures work, but also kind of show that within that, you know, the women, like, you know, survive. They're incredibly resourceful and incredibly resilient, and in very dangerous circumstances, they carry on doing what everybody does, which is try to do their best for their families.
It's really powerful, I think, to like get such intricate detail into women's lives, and to see that, like, although in like a larger structure and a larger society, women, or certain women especially, are so powerless in that outside of their families, outside of their communities, there's very little they can do that's gonna improve their lives or whatever it may be. But actually, like, in their everyday, day-to-day lives, like, these are very powerful people that are working so hard to survive and to help other people as well. Because I think what really came out through the book as well was that in the community in the red light district, there was such a sense of community. There was this sense of women helping one another and standing by one another, and, you know, kind of like having each other's back, which you don't always get. Like, not all communities are like that. So I think your book gave us such an interesting and like such an insightful view into women's lives that we don't normally see, that was so different as well from kind of what one might expect from, you know, from any kind of community in Pakistan in general. And yeah, I mean, I really appreciated that strength of character that you brought out. But yeah, my second question was about whether or not you were worried about portraying too much negativity or stereotypes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. I think the stereotype, for me, I feel like the more individual and unique a character is, that's kind of your best bet against fighting stereotypes, which is to show that people are really complicated. Stereotypes reduce people to kind of one thing. Everybody's like this. So I was hoping that the difference between the women would underline the fact that, you know, we're all unique and they all have a unique take on this. The negativity, you know, I was aware that, and I think particularly in a Pakistani context, you know, you're aware that there are certain things we don't talk about very much. And we certainly don't talk about them in the drawing room. I knew that in a way, writing any of this material could be seen as kind of as negative, but also like a kind of like, you shouldn't be washing our dirty laundry in public. You know, I was worried about that, or conscious that would be a reaction I would get. But what's been really interesting is that actually the Pakistani readers who've talked to me about it have not had that view. Like, I think they've kind of appreciated the chance to kind of think about these things that we don't talk about a lot, or certainly not very openly. And I think the other thing was that while what they've said to me is that while, there are a lot of things that are very negative and quite bleak in the book and disturbing as well, if the world feels real and if the characters feel kind of human to them, then it doesn't feel negative in that same way. Not in this kind of sort of one note way. And I think that was my aim. Was that, there's going to be a lot of things that are really difficult and uncomfortable and that are not kind of, they're not tourism pictures, yes, at all, but they are truthful about the nature of how a society works. And that if you as a writer are trying to do that usually your audience, even if it's negative, even if it's very uncomfortable for them, will kind of go with you to try and understand the material or what you're trying to do with the material.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think from maybe like a sociological perspective, so I work in the charity sector, and my husband actually, he also works in the sector, and he does a lot in terms of actual program management and delivery and design, and has done some work with some very marginalized communities across Pakistan, including street children. But when we talk about street children in the sector, often we also talk about children from brothel communities. When we look at it, actually, the vulnerability of these children and the women in general, but children especially, is so high. And there is actually so much complexity if we want to break those cycles of poverty, because a lot of these children are not legally registered. They don't have, they don't know who their fathers are, so they don't, and in a country like Pakistan, that's hugely problematic. What is their surname? And so if we really want to focus on making a difference and trying to make some of these things better, actually understanding it a little bit more and making ourselves or allowing ourselves to feel uncomfortable in understanding the different layers, I think is so important. And so I think from that perspective, I was just a bit glad that stories like this will help people look at it in a way that isn't black and white and understand how complex it is, but also how potentially dangerous it is for people, and that the need that we have to acknowledge that, to try and at least put some sort of, systems in place that might protect people somewhere along the line, even if it is, with how police cases are handled or the registration of children, for example. So I think from that very real world lens as well, I think it is super important.
Yeah, I would totally agree with you.
So what did you, when you were working on the book, and obviously like you said that you'd read quite a lot and your husband had gone and visited various places, did you uncover anything that was particularly surprising or shocking that you were not expecting?
I don't know that happened. I think in a way all of it felt like a revelation, because I live, when I go to Pakistan, I live in a very, like we talked a little bit about class and the rigidity of it. I live in a very, very confined, contained world where we don't talk about these things. Drawing room conversations are about shadis and who's getting married and family gossip, and there's no talk of any of this. So in a way, all of it was a revelation. I think I began with these are the things I'm curious about. These are the things I want to know. And those were the kind of threads that I pursued. And all of it kind of uncovered a whole nother Pakistan that most of us in those nice drawing rooms are not really talking about. So I think that was probably the biggest thing. I think the other thing, in fact, because the novel also takes place in other time periods, I think those were both periods were areas of history that I didn't know a great deal about. I knew about the 1971 War of Independence that Bangladesh had fought, but I don't think I had an idea of the scale of the violence until I began the research and of the genocide that happened, because part of the story takes place during 1971 when Bangladesh is fighting for independence. The other thing that was a revelation to me was that with the Second World War material, I had no idea of how vast India's involvement had been. I grew up in England watching a lot of World War II movies. The kind that are on Sunday afternoons, like Bridge on the River Kwai or The Doctors, and I felt like I was watching those. And I didn't know of any Indian soldiers who had been those stories. So that was the other thing again. And this is one of the joys of research, and that you kind of discover things, but often things that really startle you and kind of take you aback, that you think, how could I not have known? But none of us knew. So that's the other thing I think that the book's interested in, is kind of like how we tell histories and what gets forgotten and what gets quite deliberately erased from the record. And you see that on the micro level with the characters, what they want to remember, what they don't want to remember. And also on a macro level with nations, like the way national narratives kind of evolve. So actually, I have to tell you, like, all of it was kind of one discovery, one shock after another in a way.
I think as a reader, that was the experience of reading the book as well. It kind of was like one shock after another, one layer after another. And that's also came out a lot with that dual timeline. Well, more than dual. There were maybe like 2 or 3 different times. But anyway, the multi-timelines. And yeah, I find it so fascinating. So as a writer, when it comes to your plots, are you a planner, or are you someone that kind of has a beginning, and then a lot of authors have said to me, well, when I start the book, I don't know how it's going to end, and then I get to the point where like the characters just kind of like carry the story through for me. What's your experience as a writer?
So I'm kind of a mix. I mean, I tend to have an end point that I'm writing toward. So I don't know anything that happens, but I'll have an idea in the end, this is what's going to happen. And I had that a little bit with this. And I tend to plan in a very loose way. So I'll know that there at a couple of points, 1 or 2 big things are going to happen. But most of the time I don't know. Most of the time I sit down and just begin writing. I kind of have a word count that I try and meet. And in a way, that first draft is kind of you trying to discover what your story is and who the characters are. And I think that's an interesting description that you mentioned about the writer saying, well, the characters, there comes a point where they do feel quite separate to you, and they start kind of directing the story. And it's a very unnerving feeling of like, who's in charge here? I thought it was me. But that's a really good thing when that happens. It's a long process. Like, I think, there's a reason novels often take a long time. And I'm sure part of it is I'm always interested in people's process, and if the planners are just much more efficient and much quicker, because I would like to be more efficient and quicker. But it seems that this is definitely also the way I work, without a very clear idea. But one of the good things about that I like is that you get surprised by things along the way. And that's quite exciting when you're writing. To have something happen that you did, you're like, where did that come from?
So how long did this book take you?
It was a long time. How it began really was I was writing a short story. So I wrote a short story about a murder in the red light district, and I kept trying to make it work. And I think at a couple of points, people said to me, I don't think this is ever going to work as a short story. And I finally accepted that maybe it was the beginning of a novel rather than a short story. So in that short story was written in 2011. So on and off, I think probably about 8 years it took to write the book, on and off, between my jobs and kids and everything else.
Yeah, that's quite a long time. When you got to close to that end, did you need go back? Like, did you? Because I mean, I don't imagine that you were writing from like day one. No. You don't write like the first chapter, but because it took so long, did you have any major changes, or did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the very first draft, the draft that I'm describing to you, the one without the planning, where you just write, I think probably one of the biggest changes, there were 3 siblings.
Oh.
Yeah, I know, it's a very big change. And then I got to the end and was like, oh, I don't need 3.
I don't need 3, bit brutal.
I'm going to start again now. That's why novels take a long time, is because you make these terrible errors.
You can't entire characters.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, I think a lot of changes happened. But like you say, I wasn't getting up and writing it for 8 years. It was like, I would have a summer where I wrote, and then did a bit of revision. And it's for most. I mean, I think that the reality for most writers is that this isn't your full-time job. You're always trying to fit it in around other things and around your life. I maybe it would be quicker if it was your full-time job, you'd hope. But sometimes I think, I'm not sure that even that's true.
Yeah, because I mean, I know that in my actual full-time job, I procrastinate a ridiculous amount, and I don't think it would be any different if I was writing full-time either. So I don't know if it would be any quicker. So I'm interested in knowing what writers have inspired you along your writing journey. Yeah, from the beginning.
Oh God, there's so many. I think, interestingly, a lot of playwrights as well, my mum included, but playwrights, Lorraine Hansberry, and there are certain plays that I go back to all the time. All My Sons by Arthur Miller. I love Elena Ferrante, and Toni Morrison. I think that Pakistani writers who are writing about Pakistan are always like fascinating to me and give me really interesting insights. Kamla Shamsi's work, for example, Nadeem Aslam's work. So kind of quite a range. I feel like I'm always collecting kind of writers whose work kind of resonates. I'm just looking at my bookshelves right now. And then I do read a lot of contemporary American literature as well. And I think that's also really interesting to read. And I find I'm quite inspired by a lot of that. There's a collection of stories right now that I read not long ago, If I Survive You by Jonathan Escoffery, which is longlisted for the Booker. And, it's a wonderful collection of short stories. And I found that a very inspiring kind of read as well. So I think what I think is good for me, and I think probably good for all writers really, is to read really, really widely, and also to pick things that are not your taste, and make yourself read things that you're not really used to as well. Often some of the things that are most inspiring to me are not books that I would necessarily like read for pleasure, but they're books that really made me stop and think, and, were surprising to me and arresting in different ways.
That's so interesting. That's really interesting. I also am the same, actually. Like, so when it comes to TV, I watch a lot of what would be called trash TV, right? Like, I watch Love is Blind. I love like Married at First Sight. Like, I love those shows because I think I can really like just shut down a little bit and like slow down my mind, although those shows are also full of drama. But when it comes to reading, I really use reading as a way to push myself. And I do feel like maybe I'm a bit of a snob as well because, like I have high expectations. But I really do use reading to do that. Like I will think so much before picking up a book about what I'm going to learn, about how I'm going to feel. Am I going to learn something that makes me feel uncomfortable? Am I going to learn something that challenges my stereotypes? Like, I have all of these questions when it comes to literature, and I'm so glad I do. I mean, my brother constantly tells me that I just read depressing things, and what he means is that I don't read much sort of like chilled out stories that are just purely for enjoyment. And I think it's so great that people are able to do that. But for some reason, I have always had this relationship with literature that picking up a book is just linked to really pushing yourself. And I'm kind of glad I have that. Sometimes I wish I could just, like if I go on holiday, my books do not align with the fact that I'm going on holiday. They're just the same.
No beach reads.
No beach reads.
No.
But that's just who I am. And But anyway, my final question for you is, are you working on anything else? Can we expect another book anytime soon? What's on the cards for you?
I am working on something else. I would say don't expect it soon.
Okay.
My record.
Another 8 years.
Yes. See you in 2030. But I am working. I think I'm at that stage. It's really interesting, actually, when you've been on a project for like 8 years to then have to start something new again. You kind of have forgotten what it's like to be at the beginning. And beginning is quite strange and can feel quite hard. But they're also quite exciting as well. So hopefully it'll be a good adventure, whatever happens.
Yeah, well, I will be waiting to see what happens. So thank you so much for your time today. It has been absolutely wonderful speaking to you.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. Really, really fun. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much to Aamina for her time today and for such an interesting and insightful conversation. Honestly, I learned so much and loved speaking about the different elements of the book and the different things that Aamina really wanted to explore. I enjoyed every moment of this conversation and I hope that you did too. If you enjoyed the podcast, please follow the Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media. I'd love to hear from you. I would really appreciate it if you could rate and leave a review, as it helps more people find the show.